For 21 days, nothing felt safe. Because nothing was random. He didn't hunt people. He hunted moments. The second you relaxed. The second you thought, I'm fine. That's when it happened. No warning. No pattern you could outrun. Just the quiet understanding that someone else was deciding when you lived. Early October 2002 did not announce itself as dangerous. The Washington metropolitan region moved through its routines with the confidence of familiarity. Suburban roads filled before dawn. Office parks absorbed commuters. Gas stations pulsed with short stops and small errands. The geography was known. The rhythms rehearsed. There was no visible reason to believe that ordinary movement through space had become lethal. That assumption ended with a single gunshot. On October 2nd, in Wheaton, Maryland, James D. Martin collapsed beside his car in a parking lot. He had been shopping. There was no argument, no confrontation, no warning. The sound of the shot did not echo as an alarm, but as confusion. People nearby registered the noise without understanding it. Some froze, some looked around, others kept walking. Within seconds, the shooter was gone. No one saw a face, no one saw a weapon. There was no obvious direction of escape. Police arrived to a scene that resisted explanation. There was no robbery, no personal connection, no visible suspect. The trajectory of the bullet suggested distance. The absence of witnesses suggested concealment. The killing did not look like a dispute or a targeted attack. It looked like something else. But there was not yet language for it. Within hours, investigators began to consider the possibility they most wanted to avoid. This might not be a single act of violence. It might be the beginning of something designed to repeat. The next day erased any remaining doubt. On October 3rd, shootings unfolded across multiple jurisdictions in rapid succession. They did not cluster around a single neighborhood or motive. They appeared along commuting routes, shopping centers, gas stations, sidewalks. The victims were engaged in routine activities that marked the ordinariness of suburban life. Mowing a lawn, pumping fuel, sitting on a bench, cleaning a car. The geography stretched from Montgomery County to Northern Virginia, to the District of Columbia. The time gaps between attacks were short enough to suggest movement, but long enough to deny prediction. Each scene repeated the same problem. No suspect visible, no escape witnessed, no confrontation preceding the shot. Victims fell where they stood. People nearby heard the report too late to locate its source. By the time emergency responders arrived, the shooter had already vanished into traffic patterns that erased intent. By nightfall, law enforcement agencies across Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. were coordinating under an unspoken understanding. They were chasing a threat that did not behave like a conventional offender. The shooter did not linger. He did not flee on foot. He did not leave messages. He did not demand recognition. He acted, disappeared, and repeated the process somewhere else. The randomness was the weapon. News coverage accelerated public awareness faster than investigators could assemble certainty. Images of parking lots and gas pumps repeated on television screens. Victims' names scrolled beneath footage of yellow tape and flashing lights. The absence of a suspect became the story. Without a face or description, fear expanded to fill the gap. By October 4th, behavior across the region began to change. Parents altered school routines. Outdoor recess was curtailed or canceled. Athletic practices were postponed. Children were escorted directly from vehicles to buildings. Gas station erected temporary barriers. People crouched while fueling their cars. Commuters moved in short bursts, scanning rooftops and tree lines. Office workers avoided open walkways. Public space, once neutral, became something to cross quickly. Police presence increased. But visibility did not equal reassurance. Officers stood guard outside schools and shopping centers, weapons visible, scanning the same empty distances civilians feared. Patrol patterns expanded. But the shooter did not require fixed positions. He did not need exposure. Investigators confronted a structural problem. Traditional manhunts relied on witness descriptions, getaway routes, and predictable behaviors. None of those were available. The shooter's advantage lay in distance, concealment, and mobility. The crime scenes did not connect to one another socially. There was no known message, no claimed ideology, no identifiable grievance. Ballistics began to offer the first thin thread of continuity. The weapon appeared consistent. The caliber suggested a rifle rather than a handgun. The accuracy suggested a controlled firing position. The distances suggested the shooter was not standing beside his victims. Each recovered fragment, each measured trajectory, narrowed the technical profile without narrowing the suspect pool. The case expanded faster than certainty could keep pace. Tips flooded in from the public. White vans, dark sedans, suspicious men at gas stations, unfamiliar vehicles idling too long. None of them held. Each lead consumed hours, diverted resources, and collapsed under scrutiny. Investigators worked under the pressure of a clock that reset after every shooting. Every new scene meant another failure to stop the previous one. Behind the public narrative, a quieter realization began to surface within law enforcement circles. October was not the beginning. As analysts worked backward through unsolved cases, earlier incidents began to take shape as precursors rather than anomalies. In February 2002, in Tacoma, Washington, a killing had occurred under circumstances that now appeared less isolated. In September 2002, in Clinton, Maryland, a robbery and near-fatal shooting had unfolded with similarities that demanded re-evaluation. At the time, those cases had not connected to anything larger. Now they formed a shadow timeline that suggested preparation, movement, and escalation. The idea that the violence had a prehistory shifted the investigative frame. This was not spontaneous. It was not reactive. It was not impulsive. Whatever was unfolding in October had been rehearsed elsewhere, refined through trial, and carried across state lines. Still, the public did not see that structure. What they saw was repetition without explanation. On October 7th, another shooting claimed a life near a middle school in Bowie, Maryland. The proximity to children escalated fear into outrage. School systems tightened lockdown protocols. Police expanded perimeter patrols. Helicopters scanned suburban landscapes that offered too many hiding places and too many exit routes. The shooter continued to exploit that openness. Investigators began to suspect that the shooter was firing from a vehicle, but the idea initially resisted confirmation. Witnesses reported shots without seeing muzzle flashes. Some recalled cars nearby, others did not. The inconsistency made the theory fragile, but as scene accumulated, the absence of foot escape routes and the speed of disappearance reinforced the suspicion. The shooter was not approaching his victims, he was passing them. As this realization took hold, traffic became suspect. Every passing vehicle carried the possibility of concealment. Every car window became a potential firing position. The search area expanded to highways, arterial roads, and rest stops. The shooter was no longer bound to neighborhoods. He was embedded in movement itself. Law enforcement began coordinating traffic surveillance and highway monitoring. But the region's size worked against containment. Millions of vehicles moved through Maryland and Virginia each day. Without a specific description, enforcement efforts resembled a net cast into open water. Behind the scenes, investigative teams began reconstructing the shooter's likely methods. They examined angles of impact. They mapped distances. They analyzed the timing between attacks. Slowly, a hypothesis emerged that reframed the entire case. The shooter was not leaning out of a window. He was firing from concealment. The idea that a vehicle could be modified into a firing platform offered an explanation for what witnesses could not see. It explained how the shooter could remain unseen, fire accurately, and depart immediately without exposing himself. It suggested planning, mechanical modification, and a deliberate system rather than improvisation. This possibility elevated the threat from dangerous to sophisticated. By mid-October, fear had become ambient. It did not spike and recede. It settled. People adapted to it the way they adapted to weather. It shaped choices without dominating conversation. People learned where not to stand, how to move, when to hurry. The region functioned under a low-grade emergency that did not require sirens to be felt. Meanwhile, the shooter adjusted as well. On October 14th, a shooting at a Home Depot parking lot in Falls Church, Virginia, wounded a teenager. The survival of the victim offered investigators a rare opportunity. The angle of fire, the bullet trajectory, and the shooter's distance could be reconstructed with greater precision. The technical profile sharpened. Still, the shooter remained unidentified. The first direct communication from the perpetrators changed the case again. Messages left at scenes and delivered through intermediaries indicated an attempt to control the investigation, to redirect attention, and to establish leverage. A demand for money reframed the violence as extortion, but the killings did not pause. The threat was not conditional. It was ongoing. Investigators now faced a dual imperative: stop the shootings and resist manipulation. Any silence risked provoking it. The pressure intensified. On October 19, a man was shot and wounded in Ashland, Virginia. The geographic spread continued. The ability to predict the next location remained elusive. The only constant was mobility. Then on October 22nd, in Aspen Hill, Maryland, Conrad E. Johnson was killed while waiting at a bus stop. He was a public transit driver. He was performing a routine task in a familiar place. The shooting confirmed that the threat had not diminished. It had endured. That night, investigators worked with the understanding that the window was closing. Evidence had accumulated. Vehicle descriptions had narrowed. A blue Chevrolet Caprice had emerged as a credible focus. Alerts circulated with urgency that reflected desperation as much as confidence. The region watched the roads. In the early hours of October 24, at a rest stop off Interstate 70 in Maryland, patrol officers noticed a vehicle matching the description. Inside were two individuals asleep. The arrest unfolded without resistance. The violence stopped not with a confrontation, but with a quiet removal from motion. The subsequent searches confirmed what investigators had only theorized. The vehicle had been modified to allow concealed firing from the trunk. A rifle was recovered. Maps and materials documented planning and movement. The method that had confounded an entire region was now visible in physical form. The manhunt ended where it had begun, not with spectacle, but with confirmation. In the weeks and years that followed, the legal process would impose structure where terror had dissolved it. Trials would establish responsibility. Sentences would impose permanence. The region would return to routine. But the memory of October would remain embedded in how public space was understood. The story did not end with relief. It ended with recognition. A single shooter, operating from a moving vehicle, had altered how an entire metropolitan area understood vulnerability. The lesson was not about panic. It was about proximity, visibility, and the thinness of safety in ordinary places. October 2002 did not just record a series of crimes. It marked a shift in how fear could be delivered, and how difficult it could be to see coming. The violence that would later paralyze the Washington metropolitan region did not emerge spontaneously. It did not erupt from nowhere, nor did it represent a sudden loss of control. It developed gradually, carried across state lines through routine travel, unremarkable decisions, and actions that initially failed to draw attention beyond their immediate scenes. By the time October 2002 arrived, the foundations of the violence were already in place, reinforced by repetition and by the absence of consequence. John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo moved through the United States without urgency and without spectacle. Their movements did not attract interest because they resembled ordinary travel. Cars on highways, stops at motels, brief stays, departures before familiarity could form. Their presence in any one place was temporary, and their departures erased the context investigators often rely on to establish patterns. What they left behind were isolated incidents that appeared unconnected, and therefore manageable as separate cases. Muhammad, older and decisive, exerted control through logistics rather than noise. He selected destinations, managed transportation, handled firearms, and determined timing. His background included exposure to weapons, discipline, and hierarchical thinking. Malvo, still a minor during much of this period, existed within that framework. He followed routes already chosen, absorbed reality established, and learned through proximity rather than instruction. Their relationship functioned less as a partnership than as a system with defined authority. In February 2002, that system produced its first confirmed, fatal outcome. On February 16th, in Tacoma, Washington, a young woman was shot and killed in a parking lot. The killing was sudden and unaccompanied by any visible confrontation. There were no known witnesses who could provide a suspect description, no clear motive, and no immediate narrative beyond homicide. The investigation proceeded within local parameters, constrained by the same limitations that stall many cases: limited evidence, no suspect, and no clear direction. At the time, the Tacoma killing did not stand out. It did not trigger interstate alerts or task force coordination. It did not resemble a spree or signal escalation. It entered the system as an unresolved case, one more file in a department already managing many. The absence of resolution did not indicate complexity so much as exhaustion. Without leverage, the case slowed and eventually settled into dormancy. For Muhammad and Malvo, the outcome was not dormancy, but validation. The killing demonstrated that a person could be shot in a public place, at distance, without immediate identification of the shooter. It demonstrated that escape could be achieved through normal traffic flow, rather than flight. It demonstrated that fear could be created without confrontation, and that law enforcement response would arrive after the shooter was already gone. Most importantly, it demonstrated that nothing would follow them beyond the perimeter of the scene. That knowledge mattered. After Tacoma, the pair continued moving. They did not settle. They did not return to the scene. They did not linger in the region. Their mobility erased continuity, and with it erased suspicion. Their vehicle became not just transportation but insulation, carrying them away from each incident before investigative attention could congeal. As spring turned to summer, no alarm followed them. No agencies connected their names to violence. No warrants pursued them across jurisdictions. The absence of pursuit reinforced the lesson already learned. Violence, when executed at distance and paired with immediate departure, did not automatically generate consequences. By September 2002, the system was ready to repeat itself. On September 5th, in Clinton, Maryland, a liquor store robbery escalated into gunfire. A victim was shot and gravely wounded, but survived. Again, the scene resisted clarity. The shooting occurred quickly. The perpetrators were gone before witnesses could assemble a coherent picture. The focus of the investigation centered on robbery, rather than trajectory. The fact that the victim survived allowed the case to remain localized, rather than elevated. At the time, Clinton did not connect backward to Tacoma. There was no reason for investigators to look thousands of miles west for context. The crime fit within a familiar category: armed robbery with violence. It was serious, but not singular. Only later would investigators understand that Clinton represented a transition rather than an endpoint. Between February and September, Muhammad and Malvo refined their approach. They learned where attention gathered and where it dissipated. They learned which scenes generate sustained investigation and which dissolved into paperwork. They learned that movement was protection. They learned that distance reduced memory. The firearm that would later become infamous was already part of their environment. A Bushmaster .23 rifle entered their possession before the Beltway shootings began. Its characteristics made it suitable for controlled, accurate fire from distance. Its presence did not attract attention on its own. Firearms, without context, do not announce intent. The difference lay in how the rifle would be integrated into a system of concealment and mobility. The idea of killing from distance was not incidental. It was central. Distance reduced exposure. Distance reduced the need for confrontation. Distance reduced the number of variables that could interfere with escape. It allowed the shooter to select moments of vulnerability without entering the space of the victim. This approach required patience and discipline. It required observation. It required an understanding of angles, timing, and environment. These were not instincts developed overnight. They were acquired through repetition and reinforced through success. As September progressed, Muhammad and Malvo moved through Maryland and surrounding areas with increasing familiarity. They observed how people moved through public spaces. They noted how long individuals remained stationary at gas pumps, parking lots, sidewalks, and benches. They identified locations where visibility was limited and escape routes were abundant. These observations did not attract attention because observation itself is not illegal. By the end of September, the elements had aligned. The earlier killings had demonstrated feasibility. The weapon was available. The vehicle was selected. The experience of evasion had reduced hesitation. What remained was scale. October did not arrive with warning signs. It arrived through routine. On October 2nd, 2002, the killing of James D. Martin in Wheaton, Maryland, appeared initially as another isolated homicide. Investigators responded as they always had. They secured the scene. They canvassed the area. They searched for witnesses. The absence of immediate answers did not yet suggest pattern. It suggested difficulty. Only with the passage of hours did unease begin to surface. When October 3 produced multiple shootings across Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, the assumption of isolation collapsed. Investigators recognized that they were not dealing with a series of unrelated crimes, but with a sustained threat, operating across jurisdictional boundaries. The earlier cases in Tacoma and Clinton resurfaced, not as solved mysteries, but as unresolved precedents. Files were reopened, timelines were reconstructed, movements were re-examined. What had once appeared as coincidence began to look like continuity. Ballistics analysis provided one of the first concrete links. The rifle used in October matched characteristics seen in earlier cases. The weapon did not change. The geography did. That consistency forced investigators to reconsider the earlier incidents, not as anomalies, but as components of a larger sequence. As the backward reconstruction progressed, Muhammad and Malvo's presence aligned with the unresolved cases. Their travel history placed them in proximity to Tacoma in February, and Maryland in September. Their vehicle records aligned with movement patterns now under scrutiny. What had once appeared ordinary now appeared intentional. The idea that October represented an escalation rather than a beginning altered the entire frame of the investigation. This was not reactive violence. It was execution. The vehicle that facilitated this execution was not an afterthought. The 1990 Chevrolet Caprice offered size without distinction. Its trunk could accommodate modification without altering the vehicle's exterior appearance. Its interior allowed movement between compartments. It blended into traffic patterns common across suburban America. It did not draw attention because it did not need to. The modifications that transformed the Caprice into a firing platform required planning and testing. A firing port was created. Access between the passenger compartment and trunk was configured. The rifle could be positioned and discharged without exposing the shooter. This setup allowed the car itself to function as concealment. Before October, this configuration existed as potential. During October, it became operational. Law enforcement would later understand that this system explained what witnesses could not articulate. Shots came from nowhere. because they came from everywhere. Any car could be the source. Any pause in movement could be fatal. The shooter did not need to exit the vehicle. He did not need to be seen. He did not need to flee. Before October, these advantages were theoretical. During October, they were proven. The earlier crimes mattered because they reduced uncertainty. Each unsolved killing demonstrated that the system worked. Each successful escape reinforced confidence. Each jurisdictional boundary, crossed without consequence, confirmed that mobility diluted accountability. By the time October began, hesitation was no longer part of the equation. As investigators pieced together the pre-October violence, they confronted the limits of hindsight. Evidence from earlier cases had been processed according to the standards and priorities of their time. Some details were lost, some witnesses were unavailable, some opportunities for early linkage had passed. Still, enough remained to establish continuity. The Clinton shooting provided insight into escalation. The Tacoma killing provided proof of capability. Together they formed a shadow prologue to October, one that unfolded without public awareness, but with accumulating confidence on the part of the perpetrators. The violence that preceded the Beltway shootings conditioned the shooter to distance, anonymity, and repetition. It conditioned him to expect delay, rather than pursuit. It conditioned him to believe that movement equaled safety. By the time the first October victim fell, the violence was no longer exploratory. It was practiced. And practice, once reinforced, seeks expansion. October 2nd, 2002, began without distinction. In Wheaton, Maryland, the morning followed familiar patterns, shaped by suburban routine. Parking lots filled and emptied in short cycles. Errands were compressed between work obligations. People moved through commercial spaces without awareness of one another, connected only by proximity and timing. There was no visible tension in the air, no altered behavior, no hint that public space had become contested. James D. Martin was one of many people moving through that environment. His presence did not draw attention, because nothing about it needed to. He parked his car, exited the vehicle, and entered a commercial area that had seen thousands of similar moments before. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no visible threat. The environment offered no warning. The gunshot that killed him did not arrive as a spectacle. It arrived as a rupture. Those nearby heard a sound that did not immediately register as gunfire. Some interpreted it as a mechanical noise, a car backfiring, a distant impact, without context. The delay between sound and understanding created confusion rather than panic. By the time recognition caught up, Martin had already fallen. The shooter was already gone. The absence of a visible assailant was immediate and unsettling. No one could point, no one could describe movement. Away from the scene, there was no figure running, no car accelerating dramatically, no obvious direction of escape. The violence appeared disconnected from the physical space in which it occurred. Emergency responders arrived to a scene that resisted narrative. There was a victim, a wound, and a location. What was missing was the story that usually accompanies violence. There was no argument to reconstruct, no suspect to pursue, no immediate motive to evaluate. The killing stood alone, stripped of explanation. Law enforcement secured the area and began the familiar process of canvassing. Officer questioned witnesses whose answers converged on uncertainty. People had been present, but no one had seen anything actionable. Some had heard the sound. Others noticed the victim only after he had fallen. No one had seen a shooter. No one had seen a weapon. The lack of visual confirmation forced investigators to consider distance immediately. The trajectory of the bullet suggested that the shooter had not been standing close to the victim. The angle indicated a firing position removed from the immediate scene. This realization complicated the search area exponentially. Parking lots are not closed systems. They bleed into roadways, buildings, trees, and open sightlines. A shooter firing from a distance could be anywhere beyond the immediate perimeter. The absence of shell casings nearby reinforced this possibility. If the shooter had been farther away, the evidence might not be present at the scene at all. This uncertainty slowed momentum. Without a suspect description or direction of travel, patrol units had nothing to chase. Roadblocks without a target risked stopping everyone and no one. The scene became static, frozen around the victim, while the shooter continued moving through the region. At this stage, the killing was still treated as an isolated homicide. Investigators considered personal motives, workplace disputes, and random violence. There was no reason yet to elevate the case beyond its immediate jurisdiction. The fact that the shooter had not been seen did not automatically imply pattern. It implied difficulty. That assumption would last less than 24 hours. As investigators worked through the afternoon, forensic teams processed the scene with attention to detail that reflected unease rather than certainty. Bullet fragments were collected. Trajectory paths were measured. Environmental features were photographed and logged. Every detail was preserved, not because it clearly mattered yet, but because the absence of clarity demanded caution. Behind the scenes, analysts began comparing the scene to other unresolved shootings. This was not yet a formal pattern search. It was a reflex shaped by experience. Cases that defy explanation often do so because their context lies elsewhere. The possibility lingered, unspoken, but present, that this was not a standalone event. By evening, the killing had entered local news cycles. Reports described a fatal shooting in a parking lot, with no suspect identified. The coverage was factual, restrained and local in scope. It did not suggest escalation. It did not suggest danger beyond the immediate area. At that moment, the public did not yet understand that October had begun. Within law enforcement circles, the uncertainty persisted. The absence of progress did not yet feel like failure. It felt like delay. Investigators expected leads to emerge through tips, surveillance footage, or forensic analysis. Time was still assumed to be an ally. Overnight, that assumption would collapse. On the morning of October 3rd, shootings began again. The first reports arrived quickly, followed by others. Locations differed. Jurisdictions differed. Victims differed. What did not differ was the structure of the violence. Sudden shots. Victim engaged in ordinary activities. No visible shooter. No immediate escape observed. The realization struck with force. October 2 had not been an anomaly. It had been the opening. The killing of James D. Martin retroactively changed meaning. It was no longer a single tragedy. It was the first confirmed point in a sequence. Investigators now viewed it through a different lens, one sharpened by repetition. The absence of a suspect description became more troubling. One unseen shooter might be coincidence. Multiple unseen shooters across locations suggested method. The probability that witnesses repeatedly failed to notice the same type of suspect diminished rapidly. What remained was concealment. As agencies across Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. began coordinating, the scope of the problem expanded. Multiple departments now shared responsibility for stopping a threat that did not respect boundaries. Communication channels were established quickly, but coordination does not produce answers by itself. It organizes uncertainty. Ballistics units began expedited comparisons. Early indications suggested the same type of weapon was being used. This did not yet confirm a single shooter, but it narrowed possibilities. A rifle rather than a handgun explained distance. Accuracy suggested control rather than panic. The idea that the shooter might be firing from a vehicle gained traction. Witnesses recalled cars present near scenes, though none could identify them conclusively. The theory explained how the shooter could arrive and leave without being seen on foot. It also explained why patrol unit had not intercepted anyone fleeing scenes. At this point, the investigation faced a structural disadvantage. The shooter's mobility outpaced investigative response. Each new scene reset the clock. Each response occurred after the shooter had already moved on. There was no opportunity to catch him in transition. Meanwhile, public awareness began to change behavior. News coverage expanded beyond local reporting. The phrase serial shooter entered conversation cautiously. Authorities avoided definitive language, but the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. The public absorbed the information not through panic, but through adjustment. People altered routines without being instructed to do so. Gas station customers stayed low. Office workers moved quickly between buildings. Parents escorted children more closely. These changes did not emerge from official directives, but from collective inference. The region learned without being taught. Law enforcement increased visible presence around schools and public spaces. Patrol cars idled near entrances. Officers scanned open areas with heightened attention. The visibility was intended to reassure, but it also signaled seriousness. The presence of weapons and alert posture communicated risk even without words. Behind the scenes, investigators returned to the October 2 scene with renewed scrutiny. The parking lot in Wheaton was re-examined, not just as a location, but as a firing environment. Lines of sight were traced beyond the immediate area. Elevated positions were considered. Tree lines, buildings, and roadways were mapped relative to the victim's position. The conclusion grew clearer. The shooter had not needed to be close. This realization reframed the manhunt. If the shooter could fire from a distance, then the search area for each attack extended far beyond the immediate perimeter. Traditional containment strategies lost effectiveness. The shooter could be blocks away, already moving, already blending into traffic. Investigators faced an uncomfortable truth. They were reacting to a threat designed to stay ahead of reaction. As October 3 unfolded, the killings continued. Each new report reinforced the same structure. Ordinary activity interrupted by sudden death. No warning. No visible assailant. The absence of randomness in method made the randomness of location more terrifying. The question investigators now confronted was not whether this would continue, but how long it could continue before interruption. October 2 had been the moment when violence crossed a threshold, not because it was the first killing, but because it introduced a system into public space, a system that did not announce itself, did not reveal its operator, and did not require confrontation. In hindsight, that first day contained all the elements that would define the month: distance, mobility, anonymity, the exploitation of routine. The region would later remember October 2 as the day fear entered parking lots. At the time, it was remembered only as a tragedy waiting to be contextualized. Context arrived too quickly. By the end of October 3rd, investigators understood that they were no longer investigating a homicide. They were attempting to stop a process already in motion. And the process showed no sign of slowing. October 3rd, 2002 did not unfold like a continuation. It unfolded like an exposure. What had been uncertain on October 2 became undeniable within hours. The idea that the previous day's killing might be isolated collapsed as reports arrived from different locations, different jurisdictions, and different communities, all sharing the same unsettling structure. Violence was no longer speculative. It was active, mobile, and repeating. The first shooting of the day came early. James L. Sonny Buchanan Jr. was mowing the lawn outside his home in Silver Spring, Maryland. The task was ordinary, repetitive, and predictable. He was visible, stationary, and focused on his work. The shot struck him without warning. There was no argument, no approach, no interaction. Neighbors heard the sound and turned toward it too late to understand its source. Once again, there was no visible shooter. No one saw anyone run. No vehicle fled at speed. The scene offered the same absence that had defined the day before. Emergency responders arrived to a quiet residential street that did not look like a crime scene until they were told it was. The lawnmower stood where it had been left. The body lay where it fell. The violence felt disconnected from the space it occupied. Investigators recognized immediately that this was not October 2, repeating itself by chance. This was October continuing. Less than an hour later, in Aspen Hill, Maryland, Prem Kumar A. Walekar was shot and killed while pumping gas. The setting could not have been more public. Gas stations are designed for visibility. Cars move in and out. People stand in open view. The act of fueling a vehicle requires stillness, but not isolation. The fact that the shooter could strike in such an environment without being seen intensified concern. Witnesses heard the shot, but could not locate its origin. Some dropped to the ground, instinctively. Others ran. No one saw a person holding a weapon. The shooter was already gone. Surveillance footage, where available, showed normal traffic flow before and after the moment of violence. Nothing dramatic marked the departure. As reports moved through command centers, the tempo of the investigation changed. What had been a potential serial offense now presented as a sequence unfolding in real time. The space in between attacks suggested movement, rather than coincidence. The shooter was not waiting days or weeks. He was acting within hours. Shortly after, in Kensington, Maryland, Sarah Ramos was shot and killed while sitting on a bench reading a book. The quiet of the scene contrasted sharply with the violence inflicted. She was not engaged in transit. She was not rushing or distracted. She was stationary in a space meant for rest. The randomness of the act removed any remaining comfort people might have found in situational awareness. This shooting reinforced a crucial realization. The shooter was not selecting targets based on environment alone. He was selecting moments of stillness. The common thread was not location type, but vulnerability, created by pause. Whether mowing a lawn, pumping gas, or sitting on a bench, each victim was briefly fixed in space. As the morning progressed, the geographic spread widened. In Spotsylvania County, Virginia, Lori Lewis Rivera was shot and killed while vacuuming her car at a gas station. The repetition of setting, fuel stations, parking areas, was no longer incidental. These were spaces where people predictably exited vehicles and focused on tasks that required attention downward rather than airway. The shooter exploited that predictability. Virginia law enforcement now entered the crisis directly. What had begun as a Maryland investigation became regional within hours. Information sharing accelerated, but acceleration did not equal clarity. Each department brought its own protocols, data systems, and jurisdictional limits. Coordination required translation, as well as communication. The shooter did not pause for that coordination. Later that day, in the District of Columbia, Pascal Charlat was shot and killed on a residential street. The inclusion of the nation's capital removed any remaining illusion of containment. The threat did not respect county lines, state borders, or symbolic boundaries. It existed wherever routine intersected with exposure. By midday, 5 people had been killed across multiple jurisdictions. The spacing of attacks suggested deliberate movement, rather than impulse. The shooter was not panicking. He was navigating. Investigators faced immediate overload. Each scene required processing. Each jurisdiction required command. Each victim required identification and notification. Meanwhile, the shooter remained active, and no perimeter could be meaningfully established without knowing where to place it. The absence of witnesses now carried diagnostic weight. 1 or 2 scenes without sighting could be coincidence. 5 scenes across different environments without a single confirmed visual of the shooter indicated method. The shooter was not being missed by chance. He was being concealed by design. Ballistics units worked at maximum speed. Preliminary analysis suggested the same type of weapon was being used across the scenes. The rifle hypothesis solidified. Accuracy and consistency pointed toward controlled fire, rather than erratic discharge. The shooter was not spraying bullets. He was firing single, lethal shots. The realization that the shooter was likely using a rifle at distance reframed the public danger. A handgun requires proximity. A rifle does not. The shooter could be hundreds of feet away, partially obscured, already retreating as victims fell. This expanded the possible firing locations exponentially. As news coverage intensified, the region's behavior changed visibly. Gas stations emptied or filled with crouching customers. People pumped fuel quickly, scanning surroundings, keeping heads low. Some stations closed temporarily. Others erected makeshift barriers. Schools canceled outdoor activities. Office buildings restricted access points. Parents altered drop-off routines. These changes were not mandated universally. They emerged organically as collective adaptation. Law enforcement increased visible presence. But the presence carried an unintended message. Officers scanning rooftops and tree lines acknowledged that the threat was not ground level. Patrol cars could not watch everything. Helicopters could not hover over every neighborhood. The environment favored the shooter. Throughout the day, command centers tracked the timeline with growing concern. The spacing between attacks suggested that the shooter was comfortable operating under daylight conditions. He did not rely on darkness. He did not wait for reduced visibility. This confidence implied planning rather than desperation. The investigation now confronted a fundamental question. Was the shooter reacting to opportunity? Or was he selecting locations in advance? The pattern suggested both. Public spaces offered opportunity, but the precision of timing suggested reconnaissance. The shooter appeared to know where people would pause. Late in the afternoon, the pace slowed. No additional shootings were reported. The absence created tension rather than relief. Investigators understood that pauses did not signify cessation. They signified movement, rest, or rectified. By evening, the full scope of the day was visible. 5 dead across 3 jurisdictions. No suspect description. No confirmed vehicle. No immediate way to predict the next attack. The region was not dealing with a criminal event. It was dealing with a mobile threat, embedded in everyday movement. That night, law enforcement agencies convened emergency coordination meetings. Resources were pooled. Jurisdictional rivalries were set aside. Federal agencies began deeper involvement. The case demanded scale. Behind closed doors, investigators acknowledged the magnitude of the challenge. Traditional investigative timelines assumed crimes occurred, then were solved. This case inverted that order. Crimes were occurring faster than they could be contextualized. Stopping the shooter required understanding him while he was still active. The idea that October 2 might have been stopped in isolation now appeared naive. October 30 demonstrated that the violence was not self-limiting. It would continue until interrupted. The public absorbed this reality unevenly. Some responded with fear, others with anger, many with quiet adjustment. The absence of a face allowed fear to diffuse, rather than focus. The shooter could be anywhere, because he had not been seen anywhere. By the end of October 30, the region understood something fundamental. The question was no longer whether the shooter would strike again. The question was how many opportunities he would have before he was stopped. The investigation entered a new phase, not one of reaction, but of survival. October was no longer unfolding. It was accelerating. By the morning of October 4th, 2002, the investigation had already outrun its original shape. What began as a homicide inquiry had become a regional emergency operating, without a vigilant adversary. The violence of October 3 did not simply add casualties. It altered the logic of the pursuit. Law enforcement agencies were no longer reacting to crime scenes in sequence. They were attempting to interrupt a process unfolding faster than analysis could stabilize. Command centers across Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia shifted from case-based investigation to threat-based coordination. This change was not cosmetic. It required abandoning assumptions embedded in decades of policing practice. There was no suspect to interrogate, no social circle to penetrate, no known motive to exploit. The shooter existed only through the effects he left behind. The first priority was containment, but containment without a defined target produced diminishing returns. Patrol saturation increased around schools, gas stations, shopping centers, and commuter corridors. Officers were placed where fear was highest, rather than where probability was strongest. Visibility calmed the public in some areas, and heightened anxiety in others. The presence of armed officers scanning rooftops and tree lines reinforced the idea that danger was vertical, distant, and unseen. Investigators attempted to impose structure through forensics. Ballistics comparison accelerated. Bullet fragments and casings from multiple scenes were re-examined, measured, and cross-referenced. The results confirmed what investigators already suspected. The same rifle was being used. This confirmation narrowed the offender profile but did not narrow the search area. A rifle was not unique. What mattered was how it was deployed. Trajectory analysis began to dominate discussion. At each scene, analysts traced bullet path backward, extending imaginary lines through air and landscape to identify possible firing positions. These lines rarely intersected with obvious hiding places. They crossed roads, tree lines, parking lots, and open fields. The implication was unsettling. The shooter did not require cover in the traditional sense. He required distance and timing. This realization undermined public safety strategies designed around proximity. If the shooter was not approaching victims, then barriers, lighting, and crowd density offered limited protection. Public space itself had become the risk factor. The investigation was not protecting places. It was attempting to protect moments. The volume of tips surged. Phone lines flooded with reports of suspicious vehicles, unfamiliar faces, unusual behavior. Each call demanded evaluation. Each evaluation consumed manpower. Most tips led nowhere, but none could be ignored. The sheer quantity of information created noise that threatened to obscure signal. Investigators began building behavioral profiles based not on psychology, but on logistics. The shooter appeared disciplined. He fired single shots. He did not linger. He did not engage victims. He avoided detection consistently. These traits suggested planning rather than impulse, patience rather than rage. The violence was controlled, not chaotic. Public behavior adapted faster than investigative certainty. Gas stations altered operations. Some closed temporarily. Others installed temporary barriers or cones to limit exposure. Customers crouched while fueling. People waited in cars until pumps were available to minimize time outside. These behaviors spread without instruction, a form of crowdsourced survival. Schools implemented lockdown protocols that had previously been reserved for internal threats. Outdoor activities were canceled. Drop-off and pickup routines were compressed. Students were moved quickly between buildings under supervision. The sight of children escorted by armed officers became a visual marker of the crisis. Law enforcement recognized the psychological impact of unpredictability. The shooter did not strike at symbolic locations. He did not target institutions. He targeted routine. This choice destabilized public confidence more effectively than attacking high-profile sites would have. Fear traveled with people rather than remaining fixed to places. As October progressed, investigators began revisiting earlier assumptions. The lack of eyewitnesses was no longer seen as incidental. It was seen as diagnostic. The shooter was not merely unseen. He was unseeable under normal conditions. This distinction pointed increasingly toward a firing position inside a vehicle. The vehicle theory gained strength as scenes accumulated. Witnesses recalled cars nearby but could not identify them. Surveillance footage showed normal traffic flow without anomalies. No one recalled a person standing with a weapon. The shooter appeared to be part of traffic, not separate from it. This hypothesis introduced a new level of difficulty. Traffic could not be stopped without paralyzing the region. Every sedan, SUV, and truck became a potential threat. The search space expanded to millions of moving objects. Without a specific description, enforcement strategies risked becoming indiscriminate. Investigators began searching for anomalies within movement, rather than movement itself. They examined timing between attacks, distances traveled, and likely routes connecting scenes. The pattern suggested deliberate navigation, rather than randomness. The shooter appeared to understand road networks and traffic rhythms. He avoided congestion. He selected location with multiple exit routes. This understanding shifted focus toward the shooter's relationship with space. He was not simply passing through. He was using the environment as part of his method. Roads were not just transit. They were escape vectors. Parking lots were not just targets. They were staging areas. Meanwhile, pressure mounted from political leadership and the public. The demand for progress intensified. Press conferences became more frequent. Statements were carefully worded to avoid panic. While acknowledging danger, investigators balanced transparency against the risk of revealing tactics that could be exploited. The absence of a suspect name or image frustrated the public. Fear without a face is difficult to process. It diffuses rather than concentrates. People did not know whom to avoid. They did not know where safety ended and exposure began. The result was pervasive vigilance that exhausted rather than empowered. Behind the scenes, investigators confronted the limits of technology. Surveillance cameras were unevenly distributed. License plate recognition was not yet widespread. Cell phone tracking was limited. The tools available in 2002 did not favor rapid identification of mobile offenders operating across jurisdictions. The shooter benefited from these gaps. He did not need advanced countermeasures. He needed only to exploit the normal limitations of the system. Every delay worked in his favor. Every false lead consumed resources that could not be replenished. As the days passed, investigators began considering the possibility that the shooter might seek communication. Historically, serial offenders often escalated to contact as a means of asserting control. The absence of communication thus far suggested restraint rather than absence of desire. This restraint itself became a clue. The first confirmed messages altered the investigation again. Communications left at scenes and delivered indirectly introduced a new dimension. The shooter was not content to remain entirely silent. He wanted influence. He wanted leverage. The messages demonstrated awareness of the investigation and an attempt to shape it. This shift signaled confidence, rather than desperation. Investigators now faced a dual threat: physical violence and psychological manipulation. The shooter was attempting to dictate tempo, extract concessions, and maintain dominance beyond the act of killing. Responding incorrectly risked encouraging escalation. Ignoring the message risked provoking it. The investigation's focus expanded to include linguistic analysis, behavioral inference, and threat assessment. Each message was scrutinized for consistency, authorship, and intent. The content suggested planning and an understanding of how fear propagated through media coverage. At the same time, the violence continued. Each additional shooting reinforced the shooter's advantage. He was not reacting to law enforcement pressure. He was operating alongside it, unaffected by visible patrols and public warnings. The gap between prevention and response remained intact. Investigators began narrowing vehicle descriptions based on witness recollections and scene analysis. Early reports were inconsistent, but patterns began to emerge. A dark-colored sedan, a vehicle seen idling, a car present before and gone after shots. None of this was definitive, but it began to shape alerts. The difficulty lay in specificity. Too broad a description overwhelmed enforcement. Too narrow risked missing the target. The balance between inclusivity and precision became critical. As days blurred together, fatigue set in. Investigators worked extended hours. Analysts slept in shifts. Decision-making occurred under continuous stress. Mistakes became more likely, not because of incompetence, but because of human limits. Despite this, progress accumulated slowly. Connections between earlier crimes and the current spree began to solidify. The Alabama case surfaced as more than an outlier. Fingerprint evidence from that scene promised a name. The possibility of identification introduced urgency. If the shooter could be named, he could be tracked. The shooter still had no face, but the investigation now had direction. The vehicle, the communication pattern, the ballistic consistency, and the emerging forensic links formed a framework. It was incomplete, fragile, and vulnerable to error, but it existed. For the first time since October 2nd, the investigation was no longer entirely reactive. The hunter was beginning to imagine the shape of what he was hunting. The investigation reached a turning point, not through a dramatic discovery, but through exhaustion. By mid-October 2002, every conventional explanation for the shooter's invisibility had failed. Witnesses were not simply unreliable, they were consistently absent. Scenes were not simply chaotic. They were structurally empty of human presence beyond the victim. The absence itself demanded explanation. Investigators began asking a different question, not where the shooter stood, but where he remained. The answer could not be found at any single crime scene. It emerged only when scenes were layered on top of one another, when angles were extended beyond the immediate environment, and when assumptions about exposure were stripped away. The shooter was not stepping into public space to kill. He was using public space without ever fully entering it. The vehicle theory, once speculative, hardened into necessity. Each scene offered the same contradiction. Victims were struck in open areas, yet no shooter was seen. There were no reports of someone fleeing on foot, no descriptions of a person holding a rifle, no eyewitnesses recalling a suspicious individual lingering nearby. The consistency of that absence across multiple jurisdictions eliminated coincidence. Investigators turned increasingly to geometry. Trajectory analysis from multiple scenes suggested firing positions that did not align with sidewalks, corners, or doorways. Instead, they aligned with roadways, parking areas, and zones where vehicles could pause briefly without attracting attention. The shooter did not need cover in the traditional sense. He needed alignment, distance, and time measured in seconds. This understanding reframed every earlier failure. The shooter had not been missed by witnesses. He had been hidden in plain sight. He was not blending into crowds. He was blending into traffic. The implications were severe. Traffic could not be controlled without paralyzing the region. Vehicles could not be searched without cause. The shooter's method exploited the legal and logistical boundaries that constrained law enforcement. He operated in the spaces between authority, rather than in defiance of it. As investigators explored this possibility, they began reconstructing how such a system could function. Firing a rifle from a vehicle required stability, concealment, and access. The shooter could not simply lean out of a window. The solution lay inside the vehicle. Attention turned to trunk space. Larger sedans offered room for concealment. If modified, they could allow firing from within without opening doors or windows. A firing port, concealed and controlled, could explain the lack of visible shooter and the absence of immediate escape indicators. This was not a theory born of imagination. It was a theory born of elimination. No other explanation accounted for the totality of evidence. As this concept circulated through investigative teams, it clarified past observations. Witnesses who recalled vehicles idling briefly near scenes now mattered. Surveillance footage showing normal traffic flow without anomalies now made sense. The shooter had not fled. He had departed as traffic always does. The car was not just transportation, it was infrastructure. Investigators began considering what type of vehicle could support such a system. It needed to be large enough to accommodate a person, and a rifle in the trunk. It needed to be common enough not to stand out. It needed to allow movement between compartments without exiting the vehicle. The 1990 Chevrolet Caprice fit these requirements. The Caprice was unremarkable by design. It blended into suburban traffic. It did not attract attention. Its size allowed modification without altering exterior appearance. Its interior configuration allowed access between passenger area and trunk when altered. It was not a specialized vehicle. It was ordinary. That ordinariness was its greatest asset. The modifications required to transform the Caprice into a firing platform were precise rather than complex. A small hole cut into the trunk area allowed the rifle barrel to protrude just enough to fire. Interior panels could be adjusted to permit movement between compartments. The shooter could remain hidden, fire and reposition without ever exposing himself. This configuration explained why no one saw a shooter. It explained why shots seemed to come from nowhere. It explained how the shooter could arrive, kill and vanish within seconds. It explained why no one saw someone running away. It explained why patrol units never intercepted a fleeing suspect. The shooter was never fleeing. He was already gone. As this realization took hold, the investigation entered a new phase. The question shifted from, how is this happening, to how do we stop it? Understanding the mechanism did not neutralize it. It simply revealed the scale of the challenge. Stopping a mobile firing platform required identifying the specific vehicle among millions. Investigators began reviewing traffic camera footage with new criteria. They were no longer searching for dramatic departures or erratic driving. They were searching for presence, vehicles that appeared before a shooting and were absent immediately after, cars that paused briefly without obvious reason, sedans that appeared repeatedly across different scenes. The difficulty lay in volume. Traffic cameras captured thousands of vehicles per hour. Most were irrelevant. Filtering signal from noise required time the investigation did not have. Witness tips regarding vehicles gained renewed importance. Earlier reports of dark sedans, older cars, or vehicles seen idling near scenes were re-examined. Patterns began to emerge, though none were yet conclusive. The shooter's advantage remained intact. Public behavior continued to adapt. As awareness of the vehicle theory spread internally, law enforcement adjusted deployment. Officers were positioned not just at fixed locations, but along transit corridors. Highway patrol involvement increased. Rest stops, parking areas, and roadside pull-offs received greater attention. The shooter's mobility was now the focus. Still, the shooter remained active. The knowledge that the car itself was the weapon intensified public fear. Vehicles were no longer neutral. They were potential threat platforms. The boundary between safety and danger blurred further. Anyone refueling, waiting or pausing near traffic felt exposed not to a person, but to movement itself. Investigators confronted a grim reality. The shooter's system was elegant in its simplicity. It required no advanced technology. It exploited existing infrastructure. It used legal constraints as shields. It transformed anonymity into lethality. This elegance made it difficult to disrupt. The breakthrough did not come from technology alone. It came from convergence. As the vehicle theory solidified, other strands of the investigation tightened around it. Communications from the shooter indicated awareness of law enforcement strategy. He referenced aspects of the investigation indirectly, suggesting monitoring. This awareness implied proximity rather than distance. He was not operating from a fixed hideout. He was moving with the investigation. The Alabama case, long dormant, resurfaced with renewed urgency. Fingerprint evidence from the Montgomery liquor store robbery and murder began to align with records associated with Lee Boyd Malvo. This was the first time a name attached itself meaningfully to the case. With a name came association. Records tied Malvo to John Allen Muhammad. Their movements aligned with the vehicle theory. Their possession of firearms aligned with the ballistics. Muhammad's prohibited status regarding firearm ownership elevated suspicion into urgency. The abstract shooter began to acquire human shape. Still, the vehicle remained central. The Caprice was no longer just a hypothesis. It was a target. Investigators began issuing alerts focusing on the vehicle. The description was refined cautiously. Too broad would overwhelm enforcement. Too narrow risked missing the shooter entirely. The alert spread across jurisdictions. Officers were instructed to watch for the vehicle at rest stops, parking lots, and roadside areas. The manhunt expanded from streets into pauses between streets. The shooter's advantage narrowed. This represents the moment the investigation stopped chasing shadows and began chasing structure. The car, once invisible through normalcy, became visible through understanding. The shooter's greatest strength, his integration into everyday movement, was now also his vulnerability. He could not abandon the system without exposing himself. He could not continue without remaining inside it. The road that had protected him was becoming the road that would trap him. By the third week of October 2002, the investigation no longer lacked information. It lacked coherence. Evidence existed in fragments spread across time, geography, and jurisdictional memory. The challenge was no longer discovery, but alignment. The shooter had not left nothing behind. He had left too much, scattered across systems never designed to speak to one another at speed. The turning point did not emerge from a new crime scene. It emerged from a re-evaluation of an old one. In Montgomery, Alabama, months earlier, a liquor store robbery had ended in murder. At the time, the case had been processed according to local priorities and constraints. Evidence had been collected, cataloged, and stored. Fingerprints had been recovered, entered into databases, and left to wait for a match that never arrived. The case settled into dormancy, unresolved but intact. What changed was context. As the Beltway investigation expanded, analysts began searching not just for similarity, but for continuity. They were no longer asking whether crimes resembled one another superficially. They were asking whether they could belong to the same operational system. The Alabama case, once peripheral, now demanded attention because it shared elements that mattered: a firearm, a vehicle-based escape, and a lack of immediate suspect identification. The decision to revisit Montgomery was not dramatic. It was procedural. Evidence was requested. Files were reopened. Fingerprints were re-examined with urgency that reflected the present danger rather than the past crime. What had once been processed patiently was now accelerated. The match did not arrive immediately. When it did, it changed the investigation's geometry. A fingerprint recovered from the Alabama scene matched Lee Boyd Malvo. For the first time, the shooter was no longer theoretical. Malvo's name entered the Beltway investigation, not as a suspect, but as a point of connection. Records tied him to John Allen Muhammad. Travel histories aligned. Vehicle record intersected. The relationship between the two men, previously invisible to law enforcement, now appeared as a constant thread. With names came specificity. Investigators rapidly assembled profiles. Malvo, a teenager during the Alabama crime, had moved frequently. His background included international movement, instability, and dependency. Muhammad, significantly older, carried a history of military service, firearm familiarity, and documented grievances. Their association was not incidental. It was sustained and directional. The fingerprint did not merely identify Malvo, it bridged time. It's February, it's September, it's October. What had been a spree now appeared as a campaign. The investigative focus shifted immediately. Analysts examined Muhammad's history with new intensity. His legal status regarding firearms elevated concern. Records showed he was prohibited from possessing weapons. The presence of a Bushmaster .22-3 rifle in his orbit now carried legal and tactical significance. This was no longer just about stopping shootings. It was about apprehending individuals whose continued freedom posed immediate risk. The vehicle theory tightened around the names. Records linked Muhammad to a 1990 Chevrolet Caprice. The car that had been theoretical now had an owner. The owner now had a history. The history now had legal vulnerabilities. The investigation's abstractions were collapsing into structure. This convergence altered operational priorities. Law enforcement shifted from broad area patrols toward targeted surveillance. Alerts became more specific. The description of the Caprice circulated with urgency. Officers were instructed not merely to observe, but to engage if the vehicle was located. The risk calculus changed. The possibility of direct confrontation entered planning. At the same time, investigators had to move carefully. Premature exposure of the suspect risked flight or escalation. The shooter had already demonstrated awareness of investigative pressure. He had communicated. He had adjusted behavior. He was not passive. The messages connected to the extortion demand now took on sharper meaning. The demand for $10 million was no longer viewed solely as leverage. It was viewed as a performance. It suggested control, confidence, and a belief that law enforcement could be manipulated. The demand did not replace the violence. It accompanied it. The killings continued, despite the demand, reinforcing the idea that compliance was not the goal. Dominance was. Investigators understood that the shooter's communication was strategic rather than emotional. He was not venting. He was testing. He was gauging response. He was attempting to force law enforcement into reactive posture. This understanding informed how agencies responded publicly and privately. Statements were calibrated. Details were withheld. The goal was to avoid signaling desperation or revealing investigative progress. Every word carried potential consequences. Behind closed doors, urgency intensified. The confirmation of identity created a narrowing window. Mohammed and Malvo were mobile. They were armed. They were experienced at evasion. Now that their anonymity was compromised, their behavior could change. The risk of escalation increased. The possibility of a final, more lethal act could not be discounted. Investigators examined travel patterns associated with Mohammed and Malvo. Credit card records, vehicle sightings, and tip reports were cross-referenced. The region became a grid, rather than a blur. Rest stops, highways and parking areas emerged as focal points. The shooter's reliance on mobility became his vulnerability. The role of the public shifted subtly. Earlier, the public had been passive recipients of warning. Now they became active sensors. The specificity of the vehicle alert empowered recognition. A blue Chevrolet Caprice was no longer one of many. It was a potential endpoint. This empowerment carried risk. False sightings surged. Vehicles resembling the Caprice were reported repeatedly. Officers responded cautiously, aware that mistakes could have fatal consequences. The balance between speed and accuracy became critical. Meanwhile, Mohammed and Malvo continued operating under pressure. The final fatal shooting occurred on October 22 in Aspen Hill, Maryland. Conrad E. Johnson was killed while waiting at a bus stop. The setting reinforced the shooter's persistence. Despite increased patrols, public warnings, and investigative progress, the violence continued. The shooter had not been deterred by proximity to identification. This final killing reframed urgency as immediacy. Investigators understood that the window for intervention was closing. The next encounter could be the last chance to stop further deaths. Surveillance intensified. Patrol focus sharpened. Interagency coordination reached its peak. The night of October 23 became a holding breath. Officers across the region were briefed with the most current intelligence. The vehicle description was emphasized. Rest stops were identified as potential locations where the shooter might pause long enough to be intercepted. The logic was simple. Mobility requires rest. Even the most disciplined operator must stop. In the early hours of October 24th, that logic proved correct. At a rest stop along Interstate 70 in Maryland, officers noticed a vehicle matching the description. The car was parked. Its occupants were not moving. The pause was unremarkable. In isolation, in context, it was decisive. The arrest occurred without resistance. The system that had enabled the violence now immobilized it. Searches of the vehicle confirmed what investigators had theorized for weeks. The trunk modification was present. The rifle was recovered. The mechanism was real. The evidence aligned with the narrative investigators had assembled under pressure. The bridge from Alabama to the Beltway was complete. The case no longer belonged to speculation or fear. It belonged to evidence. It ends not with relief, but with confirmation. The shooter had not been a phantom. He had been human, mobile, and methodical. The system that allowed him to operate had been understood too late to prevent all loss, but not too late to stop further killing. The road had protected him. The road had also delivered him. By the time the investigation began attaching names to the violence, the nature of the threat had already evolved. The killings were no longer the only weapon in play. They were no longer sufficient on their own. What had begun as a campaign of anonymity and distance now incorporated communication, calculation, and attempted dominance over the investigation itself. The shooter was no longer content to act without acknowledgement. He wanted leverage. Communication seeks control. It attempts to shape response, redirect resources, and force decision-making under constraint. For investigators already stretched across jurisdictions and timelines, this additional layer complicated every choice. Each message carried not just information, but intent. The earliest communications were indirect. Messages were left at or near scenes, or transmitted through intermediaries, designed to ensure discovery without revealing identity. Their purpose was not confession or explanation. It was presence. The shooter was signaling awareness of the investigation and asserting that he was not operating blindly. He was watching. Investigators understood immediately that responding incorrectly could escalate the situation. Historically, serial offenders who initiate communication often test boundaries before demanding concessions. The decision of whether to acknowledge, ignore, or counter-message carries risk. Silence can be interpreted as weakness. Engagement can invite manipulation. Each option carried potential cost. As messages accumulated, a pattern emerged. The shooter's language was not emotional or erratic. It was structured. It referenced prior events. It implied knowledge of investigative progress. This was not spontaneous expression. It was strategic signaling designed to create pressure. The demand for $10 million crystallized that strategy. The sum itself was not arbitrary. It was large enough to attract attention, and impossible to dismiss casually. It reframed the violence as extortion, but without reducing the threat. The killings did not pause with the demand. They continued. This distinction mattered. The shooter was not offering a transaction. He was asserting authority. Investigators recognized that compliance would not guarantee safety. There was no credible mechanism to enforce restraint on the shooter's side. Payment could incentivize further demands or validate the strategy. Refusal risked provocation. The extortion demand was designed to place law enforcement in a no-win position. Behind closed doors, the decision was clear. The investigation could not be steered by coercion. Public messaging became a delicate exercise. Authorities needed to reassure the public without revealing the extent of the shooter's influence. Acknowledging the demand too openly risked amplifying fear. Minimizing it risked appearing dismissive. Every statement was calibrated for effect rather than completeness. Meanwhile, the shooter continued to operate. The presence of communication did not slow the violence. It accompanied it. Each shooter reinforced the threat implicit in the messages. The shooter demonstrated that he did not need cooperation to continue. The extortion demand was not a bargaining chip. It was an assertion of power, layered on top of demonstrated capability. Investigators analyzed the communications intensively. Linguistic experts examined phrasing, syntax and structure. Behavioral analysts assessed tone and implied intent. The goal was not just to understand what was being said, but what was being attempted. The consensus emerged that the shooter sought recognition and control rather than money alone. The inclusion of symbolic elements, such as references to tarot cards, reportedly left at scenes, added to the psychological dimension. These gestures were not random. They were theatrical without being emotional. They suggested an effort to mythologize the violence, to elevate it beyond criminality into spectacle. Investigators were careful not to validate that effort. Operationally, the communications created logistical strain. Each message required authentication. Each delivery path needed tracing. Resources diverted to analyze communication were resources not available for surveillance or patrol. The shooter understood this. Communication functioned as misdirection. At the same time, the messages provided insight. The shooter's references revealed awareness of geography, timelines, and law enforcement activity. He was not isolated. He was embedded in the region, moving with it, monitoring it. This awareness suggested proximity rather than distance. He was not operating from a remote hideout. He was operating from within the environment he was exploiting. As October progressed, the investigation's dual mandate intensified. Stop the shootings, resist manipulation. These goals sometimes conflicted. Increased patrol presence reassured the public, but also created predictable patterns that the shooter could observe. Media briefings informed citizens, but also informed the shooter. The balance between transparency and strategy became increasingly fragile. The shooter's confidence appeared to grow, rather than diminish. The continued absence of capture validated his method. The continued attention validated his impact. The communications grew more assertive. The tone implied inevitability, rather than desperation. Investigators recognized this escalation as a potential precursor to riskier behavior. Offenders who feel control slipping often accelerate violence or attempt a final, dramatic act. The window between identification and apprehension was now critical. Internally, law enforcement accelerated efforts to locate the vehicle. The blue Chevrolet Caprice became the central object of focus. Alerts were refined. Patrol units received detailed briefings. Highway officers were instructed to monitor rest stops and pull-offs. Locations where mobility paused. The shooter's communications did not deter these efforts. They reinforced urgency. The final days before capture were marked by tension, rather than clarity. Investigators knew they were close, but proximity does not equal certainty. The shooter remained mobile. He remained armed. He remained unpredictable. Public fear reached a sustained plateau. The region did not panic. It endured. People adapted routines, avoided exposure, and waited. The uncertainty became part of daily life. The absence of resolution was exhausting. The killing of Conrad E. Johnson on October 22 underscored the shooter's persistence. Despite increased patrols and investigative progress, he struck again. The act communicated defiance. The pressure campaign was not a bluff. For investigators, this final killing narrowed tolerance for delay. Surveillance intensified. Patrol strategies tightened. The vehicle alert became the highest priority across jurisdictions. The investigation prepared for confrontation, rather than continuation. The shooter's communications had achieved one goal. They had forced the investigation to acknowledge him, not just as a threat, but as an adversary attempting to dictate terms. What they failed to achieve was control. The investigation did not bend. This ends with tension unresolved. The shooter has spoken. He has demanded. He has threatened. He has continued killing. But the space in which he operates has narrowed. The very visibility he sought through communication has sharpened the focus of pursuit. The pressure campaign did not break the investigation. It accelerated it. By the final phase of the manhunt, the investigation had shed nearly every remaining illusion. There would be no clean perimeter, no decisive forensic breakthrough that suddenly narrowed the search to a single address, and no dramatic confrontation born of clever deduction. What remained was pressure, applied slowly, relentlessly, and everywhere at once. The system could not trap the shooters by closing space. It could only reduce their ability to move unnoticed. The decision to release the vehicle description publicly marked a point of no return. Until that moment, law enforcement had attempted to preserve control over the pace and direction of the hunt. Releasing the description meant surrendering exclusivity in exchange for reach. It meant accepting chaos in order to gain saturation. Once the public became part of the search, the investigation would never again be contained within command rooms and task force briefings. The blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice did not arrive in public awareness as a neutral fact. It arrived already charged with weeks of fear, exhaustion, and vigilance. By the time the description was broadcast, the region had been conditioned to receive it not as information, but as instruction. People had already learned to scan gas stations, parking lots, and road shoulders for threat. The alert simply gave that vigilance a shape. News broadcasts repeated the description with urgency, but restraint. Still images of similar vehicles appeared on screens. Anchors emphasized the need for observation, rather than confrontation. Highway message boards flashed warnings that collapsed the investigation into a few words. The Caprice became an object of attention, not because it was rare, but because it was ordinary enough to be everywhere. That ordinariness produced immediate consequences. Every similar sedan became suspect. Every older blue vehicle attracted glances, second looks, and silent calculations. Drivers slowed near rest stops. Pedestrians watched traffic rather than storefronts. Employees at service stations and convenience stores adjusted routines to observe vehicles as carefully as customers. The investigation spilled into daily life without ceremony. Law enforcement prepared for volume rather than accuracy. Dispatch centers braced for calls that would arrive faster than they could be processed. Protocols were rewritten in hours to prioritize information without overwhelming response capacity. Officers were instructed repeatedly on engagement rules, emphasizing verification over instinct. The risk of misidentification was no longer theoretical. It was operational. The flood of reports began almost immediately. Sightings came from highways, suburban streets, parking lots, shopping centers, and rest areas. Most reports were incomplete. Some were contradictory. Many were wrong, but none could be dismissed outright. Each call represented a potential endpoint, and the cost of ignoring the correct one was unthinkable. Analysts worked continuously, mapping reports onto regional geography. Patterns were searched for not in certainty, but in probability. Clusters mattered more than isolated sightings. Timing mattered more than color accuracy. Movement mattered more than stillness. The data did not point cleanly in one direction, but it began to narrow the field of attention. The shooter's mobility, once their greatest advantage, now became their greatest exposure. Movement created repetition. Repetition created notice. The longer the Caprice remained on the road, the more likely it was to be seen by someone primed to see it. Every mile increased the probability of recognition. Every pause risked confirmation. Rest stops emerged as critical focal points. Unlike gas stations or parking lots tied to destinations, rest stops existed solely to interrupt movement. They required no explanation. A vehicle could remain parked for minutes or hours, without drawing suspicion under normal conditions. For fugitives dependent on anonymity, they offered temporary refuge. For law enforcement, they offered opportunity. Patrol strategies shifted accordingly. Highway units increased presence at rest areas, without creating visible saturation. Officer rotated quietly, avoiding predictable patterns. Surveillance was conducted discreetly, prioritizing observation over intervention. The goal was not deterrence, it was capture. The public, unaware of these tactical adjustments, continued adapting behavior organically. People avoided unnecessary stops. Errands were combined or postponed. Exposure time became a calculation rather than an afterthought. These behaviors were not mandated. They spread through shared awareness and repetition. Media coverage reinforced vigilance without inflaming panic. Updates emphasized the importance of reporting sightings while cautioning against direct action. The message was consistent. Observe, report, disengage. The investigation relied on public eyes, not public intervention. The Caprice was dangerous not because of speed or aggression, but because of concealment. Internally, fatigue deepened. Weeks of sustained crisis had eroded margins for error. Investigators worked extended shifts, often sleeping in fragments. Decision-making occurred under constant pressure, with the knowledge that mistakes could cost lives. Despite this, focus sharpened. The hunt was no longer abstract. It was narrowing. The shooter's communications had ceased. This silence did not reassure investigators. It heightened concern. Silence following escalation often signals concentration rather than retreat. The absence of messages suggested that the shooters were no longer testing boundaries, they were navigating them. The final days compressed time. Every sighting carried weight, every cleared report reduced options. The map of likely movement routes grew smaller. The region's road network, once an advantage, now constrained possibility. Mobility required rest. Even the most disciplined offenders could not remain in motion indefinitely. On the night of October 23rd, law enforcement briefings reflected this reality. The language shifted from conditional to expectant. Interception was no longer framed as a possibility. It was framed as imminent. Patrol units were positioned with intention rather than coverage. In the early hours of October 24th, vigilance intersected with stillness. At a rest stop along Interstate 70, in Maryland, officers noticed a vehicle matching the description. It was parked. Its presence did not violate any law. Under normal circumstances, it would have drawn no attention. Under these circumstances, it aligned with everything investigators had been waiting for. The approach was cautious and controlled. Officers observed before acting. The occupants were inside. The vehicle was not moving. The pause that had once protected the shooters now exposed them. The system they relied on required motion. Without it, they were vulnerable. The arrest occurred without resistance. There was no chase, no exchange of gunfire, no escalation. The violence ended not with confrontation, but with containment. The road that had enabled months of evasion delivered the shooters into custody during a moment of rest. Searches of the vehicle confirmed the investigation's conclusions with precision. The trunk modification was present. The firing port existed exactly as theorized. The rifle was recovered. The mechanism that had transformed ordinary space into lethal terrain was no longer hypothetical. It was physical, measurable, undeniable. For investigators, confirmation replaced speculation. The abstract threat that had shaped weeks of fear now had form. The unseen shooter was no longer unseen. The process that had operated across jurisdictions, time zones, and routine had been interrupted. The region learned the news gradually. Early morning reports spread through radio, television, and word of mouth. Commuters paused. Schools adjusted schedules once again, this time toward normal operations. Gas station reopened without barriers. The crouching posture people had adopted began to relax. Relief did not arrive instantly. The weight of what had occurred required time to settle. 10 people were dead, others were wounded. Communities had lived under sustained threat. The capture did not erase that experience. It ended it. Law enforcement did not celebrate. The conclusion of the manhunt marked the beginning of accountability, not closure. Evidence had to be processed. Jurisdictions had to coordinate prosecutions. Families had to be notified. The system shifted from pursuit to reckoning. This ends with containment, rather than triumph. The net tightened not through a single decisive act, but through accumulation of observation, of patience, of restraint. The investigation succeeded not because it eliminated uncertainty, but because it reduced the shooter's ability to hide within it. The road that had once dissolved identity into motion finally required stillness. And in that stillness, the violence ended. The days leading into October 19, 2002, carried a different texture of fear. The region was no longer shocked. It was worn. Panic had not consumed daily life, but vigilance had reshaped it into something brittle and exhausting. People moved with purpose, rather than ease. Public space remained usable, but only under mental negotiation. Every pause required awareness. Every errand carried calculation. Law enforcement felt the same fatigue, magnified by responsibility. By this stage of the investigation, the violence was understood not as a spree, but as a sustained operation approaching its endgame. Names had emerged. The vehicle had been identified. The mechanism was known. Yet the killings continued. This persistence sharpened urgency into something closer to dread. Each passing hour without interception risked become another name, another scene, another moment frozen into public memory. October 19 brought confirmation that the danger had not diminished. In Ashland, Virginia, Jeffrey Hopper was shot while closing his vehicle at a gas station. The setting was tragically familiar. A pause, a routine task, an open environment designed for speed, not shelter. The shot did not kill him, but it wounded him seriously enough to reinforce the same lesson the region had learned repeatedly. Survival did not equal safety. Injury did not equal mercy. The shooter remained committed to continuation. For investigators, the shooting carried dual weight. On one level, it was another violent act that demanded response, evidence collection, and victim care. On another, it was proof that the shooter was operating despite mounting pressure. The vehicle alerts were public. Patrols were heavy. The region was watching. None of it had stopped him. This defiance altered the psychological profile. Investigators had been assembling. The shooter was not retreating under pressure. He was not panicking. He was not accelerating recklessly. He was continuing methodically, choosing moments that aligned with opportunity, rather than symbolism. This suggested discipline, rather than desperation. The end was not chaotic, it was controlled. The Ashland shooting also reinforced an uncomfortable reality. The shooter was willing to operate in Virginia. Again, he was not constrained by geographic narrowing. The assumption that the net was tightening did not yet translate into immobilization. He remained mobile, adaptive and confident. Behind the scenes, investigators intensified coordination further. Resources were reallocated aggressively. Surveillance attention sharpened along corridor, connecting recent sightings. The rest stop focus deepened. Patrol briefings emphasize expectation rather than possibility. Officers were told not merely to watch, but to anticipate. The logic was simple. A system built on movement must pause. The public, meanwhile, absorbed the Ashland shooting with grim familiarity. News reports no longer carried surprise. They carried weight. Another gas station, another interruption of routine. The lack of novelty made the violence more oppressive, rather than less. People understood now that understanding alone did not stop bullets. Between October 19 and October 20 the region lived inside a narrowing funnel. Investigators believed they were close. The evidence suggested convergence. The vehicle description was circulating widely. Public vigilance had saturated awareness. The shooter's movement options were shrinking, even if invisibly. Yet proximity did not guarantee interception. It only increased stakes. The night of October 21 passed without incident. This absence did not reassure. It heightened tension. Silence had become suspicious. Each hour without a shooting raised the possibility of one imminent, rather than resolved. Investigators prepared for either outcome. On October 22, the final fatal shooting occurred. In Aspen Hill, Maryland, Conrad E. Johnson was shot while waiting at a bus stop. The setting carried symbolic weight, though the shooter did not need symbolism. Public transportation represented predictability, routine, and exposure. People waiting for buses are stationary by necessity. They cannot leave easily. They cannot choose cover. They are visible. Johnson was performing a daily task that connected him to others through shared schedule, rather than shared identity. He was not alone, yet he was vulnerable. The shooter exploited that vulnerability with the same precision seen throughout October. The shot killed him. The reaction to this killing differed from earlier ones not in volume, but in tone. The region did not gasp. It clenched. Investigators understood immediately that this could not be allowed to continue. The finality of Johnson's death sharpened urgency into something absolute. There was no remaining tolerance for delay. The next opportunity for interception had to succeed. The message associated with the extortion demand was discovered near the scene. This reinforced investigators' assessment that the shooter was not abandoning his psychological campaign even as the net tightened. He was asserting persistence. The message was not about negotiation. It was about reminder. He remained active. He remained capable. Internally, this discovery confirmed fears rather than surprising anyone. The shooter was not retreating quietly. He was operating until stopped. The possibility of surrender or cessation without capture was effectively dismissed. The system would end only through intervention. The investigation shifted fully into capture posture. Patrol units were repositioned. Surveillance priorities adjusted. Highway routes received intensified attention. Rest stops, especially those along east-west corridors, became primary focus points. The assumption hardened into near certainty. The shooter would pause. He would have to. The night of October 22 into October 23 unfolded under extraordinary strain. Investigators worked through exhaustion. Officers remained alert through long shifts. Decision-making compressed into narrow windows. The possibility of mistake increased, but so did resolve. The region had endured weeks of fear. It could not endure another death. The shooters, meanwhile, continued moving. Their silence following Johnson's killing did not signal remorse or hesitation. It signaled focus. They had operated under pressure before. They understood attention. They understood visibility. The system they relied on, movement, concealment, routine, was now being contested by scale rather than insight. Every mile carried risk. Every stop carried more. By the late evening of October 23, the logic of interception dominated planning. Investigators no longer debated if the shooters would be found. They debated where and when. The geography of Maryland, Virginia, and surrounding states limited options for extended movement without pause, fuel, rest, and concealment. All required stillness. Rest stops became inevitable. The early hours of October 24 approached not as a surprise, but as a culmination. Patrol units positioned along Interstate 70 operated under explicit instruction. Observe first. Confirm before engagement. Avoid premature confrontation. The objective was capture, not escalation. The shooters were armed. Any miscalculation could cost lives. Then the moment arrived. At a rest stop along I-70, a vehicle matching the description was observed parked. Its presence was unremarkable, in isolation. Under the weight of accumulated evidence, it was decisive. The timing aligned. The location aligned. The description aligned. Officers approached with caution shaped by weeks of preparation. The vehicle was occupied. The occupants were not alert. The pause that allowed rest had removed mobility. The system that had protected the shooters through motion had failed them in stillness. The arrest occurred without resistance. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic pursuit, no exchange of fire. The violence ended not with spectacle, but with containment. The same ordinariness that had concealed the shooters now closed around them. Searches confirmed everything. The modified trunk was present. The firing port existed. The rifle was recovered. Maps, tools, and equipment aligned with the investigative reconstruction. The abstract threat became physical evidence. The theory became fact. For investigators, this was not triumph. It was confirmation. The killing stopped. The region learned of the arrests as dawn approached. News traveled through radio reports, television updates, and quiet conversations. Commuters paused to listen. Parents reconsidered school routines. Gas stations opened without hesitation. The crouched posture people had adopted over weeks began to relax. Relief arrived unevenly. For some it was immediate. For others it was delayed by grief. For many it was complicated by exhaustion. The end of threat did not erase memory. It only closed the present tense. This ends not with closure, but with reckoning. The final victims, those killed and wounded in the last days, did not fall because the investigation failed. They fell because the system they faced was built to delay, rather than prevent. Their deaths hardened resolve and narrowed tolerance until intervention became inevitable. The final hours mattered because they demonstrated something essential. The violence did not end on its own. It ended because the space in which it operated collapsed. The final hours of the manhunt unfolded without drama, but not without gravity. By the early morning of October 24, 2002, the investigation had reached a state where every remaining uncertainty carried lethal potential. Law enforcement agencies were no longer attempting to understand what kind of threat they faced. That understanding had already been achieved. What remained was the fragile task of ensuring that understanding translated into physical containment before another ordinary moment was transformed into irreversible loss. The rest stop along Interstate 70 did not announce itself as the endpoint. It appeared no different from dozens of others scattered across the region. Cars arrived, paused, and departed without ceremony. People stretched, refueled, and returned to the road. Under normal conditions, it was a place defined by anonymity and transience. Under the accumulated weight of October, it had become something else entirely. A predictable interruption in motion that could no longer be ignored. Law enforcement attention had been trained on such locations deliberately. Weeks of analysis had narrowed the logic of capture. A system built on constant movement could not sustain itself indefinitely. Fuel, rest, and concealment all required moments of stillness. These moments were rare, brief, and necessary. Rest stops represented convergence points, where mobility is surrendered, however temporarily, to human limits. When officers observed the blue Chevrolet Caprice parked at the rest stop, the sight did not produce immediate certainty. It produced alignment. The timing matched the narrowing window. The vehicle matched the description, refined through countless reports and analyses. The location fit the logic of interception. No single factor would have been enough on its own. Together they demanded action. The approach was controlled, rather than reactive. Officers did not rush. They observed. The vehicle was occupied. The occupants were not alert. There was no indication of imminent movement. The pause that allowed rest had also removed the shooter's primary defense. The system that had protected them through constant motion now exposed them through stillness. The arrest itself unfolded without resistance, but its significance reverberated far beyond the immediate moment. There was no chase, no exchange of gunfire, no escalation. The violence that had dominated the region for weeks ended quietly, contained by procedure rather than force. The absence of spectacle did not diminish the importance of the capture. It underscored it. For investigators, the arrest marked the end of uncertainty, but not the end of responsibility. Capture alone was insufficient. The weeks of reconstruction, theory, and pressure had to be validated through physical evidence. Every assumption that had guided the manhunt now faced confirmation or collapse. The vehicle was secured. The scene was preserved. Protocol replaced urgency. The search of the Chevrolet Caprice began with deliberate precision. Investigators documented the exterior, noting its unremarkable appearance. There was nothing about the car that would have drawn attention under normal circumstances. That ordinariness had been its camouflage. The danger had never been visible. It had been structural. Attention shifted quickly to the interior. The modification was immediately apparent. A firing port had been cut into the trunk area, positioned to allow discharge of a rifle without opening doors or windows. Its size, placement, and concealment aligned precisely with what investigators had predicted. The port explained how shots could be fired from within the vehicle, without exposing the shooter, how witnesses could hear gunfire, without seeing a person, and how the vehicle could depart, without creating a visual focal point. This discovery did not surprise investigators, it confirmed them. The rifle was recovered shortly thereafter. The Bushmaster Frishin Tudor III, whose ballistic signature had linked shootings across Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, was now present as physical evidence. Its recovery ended any remaining debate about weapon consistency. The rifle had traveled where the shooters traveled. It had fired where victims fell. It connected every crime scene into a single unbroken chain. Additional items recovered from the vehicle reinforced the scale of planning involved. Maps marked routes rather than destinations. Tools indicated maintenance and modification rather than improvisation. Equipment aligned with observation and positioning rather than spontaneity. Nothing suggested panic. Everything suggested repetition. The evidence did not tell a story of rage. It told a story of method. For law enforcement, this confirmation produced neither relief nor satisfaction. It produced finality. The weeks of pressure, uncertainty, and fatigue had not been misplaced. The system they had hunted was real, operational, and now dismantled. The violence had not been accidental. It had been engineered. The investigation shifted immediately into its next phase. Jurisdictional coordination intensified. Once more, this time around prosecution, rather than pursuit. Evidence had to be cataloged separately, from multiple courts. Chain of custody protocols were enforced with absolute rigor. Each jurisdiction had its own victims, its own charges, and its own legal standards. The case could not be simplified for convenience. Public notification followed confirmation, but it was measured rather than celebratory. Authority emphasized containment, not victory. The threat had ended. Accountability had begun. This distinction mattered. The investigation had succeeded. But the cost remained permanent. Public reaction unfolded in stages. Some people felt immediate relief, allowing routines to resume tentatively. Others remained cautious, waiting for repetition to re-establish confidence. Many experienced exhaustion, rather than joy. Weeks of sustained vigilance had altered behavior deeply enough that normalcy required relearning. Gas stations reopened without barriers, but customers still scanned surroundings. Schools relaxed security protocols incrementally, rather than abruptly. People stood upright, while fueling cars again, but the memory of crouching did not disappear instantly. Fear had receded, but it had left residue. Behind the scenes, the investigation continued to expand rather than conclude. Interviews were conducted, statements were gathered, evidence was cross-referenced against prior reconstructions. Analysts reviewed timelines, confirming that the evidence recovered aligned with movement patterns already established. The case no longer depended on inference, it depended on documentation. John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo were transferred into custody, under condition reflecting the seriousness of their crimes. Their mobility, once absolute, was now fully constrained. The transformation, from unseen shooters to defendants, altered the narrative fundamentally. The threat no longer operated in present tense. Court proceedings would take years to unfold. Muhammad faced trial in Virginia, where evidence supported conviction and a death sentence. His execution in November 2009 closed one legal chapter definitively. Malvo, tried for crimes committed as a juvenile, received multiple life sentences, later complicated by evolving juvenile sentencing law. These developments reshaped punishment, not responsibility. For victims' families, legal resolution provided structure rather than healing. Courtrooms formalized accountability, but they did not restore ordinary moments lost to violence. The absence left behind by each victim remained anchored to routine tasks, interrupted without warning. For law enforcement, the case became a reference point, rather than a triumph. The Beltway sniper investigation demonstrated both vulnerability and resilience. The shooters had exploited infrastructure designed for efficiency and anonymity. Roads, vehicles, and rest stops had become tools of concealment. Yet the investigation had adapted, coordinated, and prevailed through persistence, rather than brilliance. The capture at the rest stop underscored a central lesson. Mobility can obscure identity, but it also creates patterns. Patterns can be observed. Observations can converge. The very system that allowed the shooters to evade capture imposed limits they could not escape indefinitely. This ends not with closure, but with consequence. The violence ended when motion stopped. The uncertainty ended when evidence replaced theory. The fear receded not because it was disproven, but because it was contained. What remained were records, memories, and a region permanently altered in how it understood public space. The road that had carried the shooters through anonymity delivered them into accountability. And in that final stillness, the hunt ended. The end of the Beltway sniper attacks did not arrive as a clean break between danger and safety. When the arrests were confirmed and the threat was officially declared over, the region did not exhale all at once. Relief emerged unevenly, tempered by disbelief and exhaustion. For weeks, fear had not announced itself through panic, but through vigilance that settled into routine. That vigilance did not dissolve, simply because the source of danger had been removed. In the days following the capture, public behavior reflected this hesitation. Gas station reopened without barriers, but customers continued to scan parking lots before stepping out of their cars. Bus stops filled again, yet people stood with heightened awareness rather than ease. Parents resumed school routines cautiously, escorting children longer than necessary. The region moved forward, but it did not reset. The memory of exposure lingered. Law enforcement agencies experienced a similar transition, one marked less by celebrations than by decompression. Officers returned to regular schedules, carrying fatigue that could not be measured in hours alone. Analysts reviewed weeks of decisions, not to assign blame, but to understand how close the system had come to failure at multiple points. The investigation had succeeded, but it had also revealed fragility, technological, procedural, and human. The legal process imposed structure on what had been chaos, but it did so slowly. Trials, motions, appeals, and sentencing stretched across years. The immediacy of the threat was replaced by the patience of judicial procedure. For the public, this shift altered perception. The story moved from daily fear into distant accountability. Yet for victims' families, the passage of time did not soften absence, it clarified it. John Allen Muhammad's prosecution in Virginia culminated in conviction and a death sentence. His execution in November 2009 marked a definitive legal endpoint to his role in the crimes. Yet execution did not erase the record of harm. It closed a case file. It did not close memory. The violence he orchestrated remained embedded in the region's understanding of vulnerability. Lee Boyd Malvo's legal path followed a more complex trajectory. Convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms for crimes committed as a juvenile, his punishment later intersected with evolving standards in juvenile sentencing law. Resentencing proceedings, delays, and legal debate reshaped how responsibility would be administered, without altering the facts of the law. Adapted. The history did not. For victims' families, courtrooms provided recognition, but not restoration. Each name entered into legal records represented a life interrupted during an ordinary moment. Mowing a lawn, pumping gas, waiting for a bus, reading a book. These details did not fade with time. They became anchors for memory, reinforcing the randomness that had made the violence so destabilizing. Public memorials appeared quietly, without coordination. Flowers placed at former crime scene remained longer than expected. Handwritten notes accumulated and were removed. These gestures were temporary, but their intent was durable. Communities marked locations not because they wanted them to become monuments, but because erasure felt wrong. The space themselves returned to function, but their history did not disappear entirely. The investigation entered professional memory. As a landmark case, law enforcement agency studied it not for heroism, but for lessons. The Beltway sniper attacks demonstrated how everyday infrastructure could be exploited for violence without attracting immediate attention. Roads, vehicles, and public routines, systems designed for efficiency and anonymity, had become tools of concealment. One of the most enduring lessons involved mobility. The case showed how a moving offender could exploit jurisdictional boundaries, technological limitations, and assumptions about visibility. The shooter had not hidden in isolation. He had hidden in normalcy. This understanding reshaped how future threats would be evaluated, particularly those that operated within ordinary systems, rather than outside them. The case also influenced public expectations of safety. Prior to October 2002, danger was often associated with specific locations or circumstances. Afterward, that assumption weakened. People learned that exposure mattered more than place. Parking lots, sidewalks, and gas stations, spaces designed for transition, were recognized as moments of vulnerability, rather than safe defaults. This awareness did not produce constant fear, but it altered instinct. Media coverage evolved alongside these lessons. Early reporting emphasized shock and uncertainty. As the investigation progressed, coverage shifted toward method, process, and consequence. This evolution influenced how future case and verification over immediacy. The Beltway sniper case became a reference point for responsible coverage under pressure. Technological reform followed in the years after. License plate recognition systems expanded. Interagency data sharing improved. Surveillance infrastructure became more integrated. These developments were not retroactive solutions, but they were shaped by vulnerabilities exposed in 2002. The case did not create modernization, but it accelerated justification for it. Yet technology alone was never the decisive factor. The investigation succeeded through accumulation, rather than innovation. Tips reported by civilians, observations made by patrol officers, patterns assembled by analysts, restraint exercised under uncertainty. The resolution emerged, not from brilliance, but from persistence and convergence. The rest stop along Interstate 70. returned to anonymity. Cars paused there without awareness of its significance. Drivers stretched, refueled, and continued their journeys. There were no markers to indicate what had occurred. The location absorbed its history quietly. Its importance remained documented rather than displayed. The region itself carried the legacy more visibly. Years later, residents could still recall how routines had changed, how fear had felt when it became ambient, rather than acute. The memory entered collective consciousness, not as a single event, but as a period defined by adaptation. October 2002 became a reference point for how a community responds when certainty dissolves. Public space never fully returned to innocence. Function resumed, but expectation changed. The idea that routine guaranteed safety did not recover entirely. Awareness remained, subtle but present, shaping behavior in ways people rarely articulated. The Beltway sniper attacks did not redefine fear. They redefined anticipation. They demonstrated that violence could arrive without warning, without proximity, and without identity. They also demonstrated that such violence could be stopped, not quickly, not easily, but decisively. Through coordination, endurance, and restraint. The story did not conclude with comfort. It concluded with understanding. October 2002 ended not when the shooters were arrested, but when the region slowly relearned how to inhabit space without constant calculation. That process took longer than headline suggested. It unfolded through repetition, trust rebuilt through time, rather than reassurance. The violence was contained, the memory endured, and the distance between those two realities became the lasting legacy of the case. Like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.